Hello there, and thanks for tuning in to what is the fifth episode of season three of Raising the Roof. I'm Nick Atkin, and you're listening to the podcast that brings together business leaders and industry experts together to unpick the hot topics, not just in housing, but also much wider as well. I'm absolutely delighted to say that today I'm joined by Jan Rosenow. He's the Director of European Programmes at the Regulatory Assistance Project. And that, if you don't know, is a global team of highly skilled energy experts. Now, what you need to know about Jan is that he's passionate about making this planet a better place for us all. And as you will know, so is Yorkshire Housing. And he's been named as one of the world's top 25 influencers in renewables and the future of energy. Wow, that is one serious CV claim. And that's because from a young age, he's devoted his life towards creating not just a clean, fair, but also efficient energy system. And that's even in the face of the climate crisis. And so the fit here is that we know that housing associations across the UK have a really strong commitment to helping the government achieve their net zero target by 2050. But Jan's here today to help us decipher really whether the nation's journey is the right one and if it's moving far enough and fast enough. So thanks for joining me, Jan, and welcome to Raising the Roof.
Thanks for having me. Looking forward to what will be a fascinating conversation, I'm sure.
Oh, absolutely. So let's get going with things. And I suppose, first of all, Jan, I've read a lot about you, but could you just sort of give our listeners a little bit more information about yourself and particularly the work that you're doing at the moment?
Yeah, absolutely. So I've worked in energy for 20 years, and my background in energy is really on energy demand. So my main interest has always been how we consume energy and how can we improve the way we do that, either by being more efficient with our energy use or by using cleaner energy or using it more smartly. So those are the kinds of things that I've always been fascinated by. And then also how that intersects with how we produce and distribute energy, so the energy system as a whole. And I've done that in a number of roles, once in consultancy, quite a while now, back in the past, so advising governments and big corporates on things like energy efficiency, for example, but also as an academic at Oxford University, sort of publishing quite detailed analytical papers on a range of questions. And the last sort of 7 years or so in a leadership role running RAP, the Regulatory Assistance Project. And we really work on policy regulation to make the energy system cleaner, more efficient, and meet the climate goals, also fairer. And we do that in a number of countries around the world. And I lead the European team of that organization, working with the UK government, but also working with governments across Europe and the European Commission to support them in their endeavors to develop and craft better policy and regulation.
That sounds like a fantastic summary of a lot of achievements that I've certainly read and researched about you. I suppose what I want to do today is talk about where national policy is going in the UK, but also what that means for housing associations. So I just wanted to start with our core product, which is obviously housing. We build and we manage homes. I know that you've had a good look at sustainability in terms of how people live their lives in terms of their domestic homes. So what does a good sustainable home look like, both now and also what do you think that'll look like in the future?
Great question. I think a good sustainable home is one that you can afford to heat, first of all, and you're comfortable in, that's healthy to live in. That's not yet fully understood. I think the implications of living in homes that suffer from damp and mold, for example, but also things like indoor air pollution related to cooking with fossil fuels, those sorts of things in the future will really have to change if we want to live in homes that are truly sustainable and healthy to live in. We'll need a combination of things to achieve that, right? I mean, one is improving the fabric efficiency. We still have a fairly poorly insulated housing stock in the UK, actually one of the worst in Europe because it's so old. We have one of the oldest housing stocks, and also we haven't really done as much as other countries in upgrading our old buildings and bring them up to standard. So there's still work to be done, some improvements over time, but there's still work to be done. And then the other big topic is, of course, how we heat those buildings.
Yeah.
and what we're going to use for that in the future, which is a huge topic of debate now in the UK about heat pumps, but also hydrogen hit the headlines quite a bit in the past. And then there's also lots of other things going on with things like district heating, for example, or communal heating projects. But I think altogether, we're kind of looking at a home that is more efficient, is going to use clean technologies to provide heat, is going to use electricity from clean sources, and will be a lot smarter. I mean, that's a really interesting area, I think, as well, to watch, where automation and smart management of energy in the home can have some real benefits for the occupants, for the people who live in these buildings, in form of more comfort and lower bills.
Yeah. I mean, it was really interesting there. You mentioned sort of the way that homes are heated and you referenced air source heat pumps. We know that here in the UK, there's a target to get to net zero by 2050. And as part of that, there is a commitment at a national level to installing about 600,000 air source heat pumps each year by 2028. There's also a pledge that all of our electricity will come from low carbon sources by 2035. From what you've seen, are those targets realistic?
I mean, 600,000 heat pumps sounds like a lot, right? We currently do about 70,000 heat pumps per year in the UK. Actually, the data isn't great, I would say, on even just those very basic data points. How many heat pumps do we actually install? The data isn't great. And that is because no one really collects the data in a particularly consistent way. But it's roughly 70,000 heat pumps. That's kind of what the government is using. That's an estimate. I think that's fairly credible. And getting to 600,000 sounds like a huge challenge. But actually, when you look at some of our European neighbors, they have had heat pump market expansion in a single year, in some cases, of more than 100%. That it means basically doubling the amount of sales. I'm not saying you can do that every single year, but you just need a few years where you hit some really high growth numbers like 50% or more, and you're actually going to get there eventually. But it's still a very significant scaling up. It's not completely unusual. We have seen in other countries in Europe, in the Netherlands, for example, which has a very similar issue with housing stock that is fairly badly insulated, using lots of gas as well. The Netherlands use even more gas for heating than the UK, with more than 90% of homes being connected to the gas grid, using it for heating. And they managed to scale up their heat pump market very, very quickly from a very low base. So it is possible, but it's going to require, I think, a few more policy changes. Maybe we can talk about that later, and they are not going to be easy. I think on electricity, we're actually on a good path. I mean, just 10 years ago, the UK used almost 40% of coal for its electricity generation. And the last coal plant will actually go offline this year, may not even come online again. It might be the last time we've seen coal being burned in the UK for electricity generation, which is a huge achievement. And when you look at the emissions from electricity, when I worked first in the UK on energy in 2006, they were probably 3.5, maybe 4 times higher per unit of electricity generated than they are today. And that happened in a period of less than 20 years. Is 2035 doable? I think it is. I mean, it's not easy. None of this is easy, but it certainly is possible when we look at the trajectory that we're on. We are right on target when it comes to the emissions from electricity in terms of bringing them down. But don't forget, the last 10% will be the hardest 10%. Yeah, that's always the challenge with these things. That's when it gets really, really hard. But we're definitely on track, and I'm quite confident that at some point in the 2030s we're going to see a close to zero emissions power system in the UK.
Okay, that's impressive. But given the fact that you work across Europe, how does the UK's performance compare to elsewhere on the continent?
When you look at electricity, pretty well. There are other countries that still use a lot of coal, like Poland, for example, or Germany, big economies, or even the Netherlands. They still have lots of coal in their system too. So there's definitely is more work to be done in other countries on that front. When it comes to renewables, the UK has really played catch up over the last decade and is now top when it comes to offshore wind, and also solar is catching on now. So the UK isn't doing badly. Of course, there are some countries like Norway that are well ahead because they have hydro and they have almost 100% renewables to make their electricity. But the UK, given where we started, we've done pretty well in cleaning up the grid. When it comes to the building stock, not so much. That's where we're quite far behind, with 95% or so of our heating being still carbon intensive from mainly fossil gas, but also still heating oil. and even some coal. So that's an area where we're not doing particularly well. In transport, there's not really that many places other than the Scandinavian countries that have really made huge inroads. The UK isn't doing badly when it comes to the deployment of electric vehicles, for example. There are other countries that are further behind. So I would say overall, no, actually not so bad. The UK has reduced its emissions at a pretty rapid pace, but mainly because we got out of coal for electricity generation. That's been the main reason why we have been able to reduce emissions so fast. And the main work that remains is now to focus on the other sectors, which is buildings we already mentioned before, transport and industry, where there's still a lot of fossil fuels being burned and not a lot of renewable energy being used.
Yeah, and just to complete the circle, because obviously you also said about making homes affordable to live in, and one of the key things to do is to take a fabric first approach. In other words, insulate the home so that you don't have to spend as much money then heating it. Again, just on a comparable terms, I'm presuming from what you were saying before that the UK isn't performing particularly well in comparison to its European neighbours.
When it comes to efficiency, yes, that is correct. And partly it has to do, I think, with the fact that the UK has fairly mild winters, right? I mean, when you live in Finland and it regularly goes to minus 20 degrees centigrade, you better have a well insulated house. Otherwise, you're really going to be very
Yeah.
uncomfortable. I mean, I don't know how cold it gets up in Yorkshire, but where I live in Oxford, when it hits -5, that's a really cold day. And that usually happens overnight.
We're still wearing t-shirts and shorts at that temperature, Jan, here.
Right,
So we're
right.
hardy folk up here. Can I also just sort of pick up on the point you made about the area where the UK is doing relatively well, which is around the transition to electric vehicles? So obviously one of the less commonly known facts is that the 26 million homes in the UK produce more carbon than the 28 million cars on the road. And yet, whilst there has been that strong focus on accelerating the switch to electric vehicles and things like the introduction of clean air zones in our cities, it doesn't feel like the decarbonisation of homes is being treated with the same priority, especially as housing clearly presents a greater potential threat to the climate. Do you have a view about why that might be? Why is the focus on cars when actually they're not producing the higher amounts of carbon that our homes are?
It's a great question. And it is indeed puzzling, when you look at surveys of the general public, what they think where the emissions come from. There's a lot of things on the top of that list where you think, well, actually that's where housing should be, and housing doesn't feature. It's at the bottom of the list in many of those surveys, which is concerning. About 23% of the UK's carbon emissions are from buildings, and most of that is basically heating our buildings with gas. So there's a complete lack of awareness. Why is there less policy attention? I mean, there used to be a time when there was a lot of activity in cleaning up and improving the UK's housing stock. I mean, you probably remember well the Decent Homes program, Warm Front. Yeah, there were programs like CERT and CESP under previous government, which were quite big and I would say overall pretty successful. They were by no means perfect. They had their own issues. But we've done away with a lot of that. And after 2012, after the Green Deal was coming in, some of the listeners might still remember that was a policy that was supposed to revolutionize the housing market and create a real pull for energy efficiency. I think the government wanted to do 14 million homes by 2020, and they managed 14,000. So 0.1% of the target. And after that, there was this impression that anything to do with housing and energy efficiency is just too difficult and it's not going to work. I think that's a misperception. I think it really is to do with a fairly poorly designed policy at the time, that the industry and many experts actually said, this is not going to work. And the government didn't listen at the time. But I think we're now moving again towards a place where politicians are more willing to have a go at this again. It is harder than providing some incentives for electric vehicles. We're dealing with more complex issues, energy efficiency, heating systems, people's homes. They're all a bit different. They're complex. Cars are less complicated in that way. You just buy a new car. Yes, you might need a charge point, but it's a little bit more straightforward, I would argue, than going about decarbonizing a housing stock, which is more challenging.
Yeah, and we also had one of our previous guests, Steve McKenzie, on, and he was talking about what it's like to live in a low carbon home as a Yorkshire Housing customer, funnily enough. And he was sort of saying that, that's a big challenge because the transition in terms of how you use the home is very different in the same way that it is between an electric vehicle and, say, a fossil fueled car, but probably more so. And some of the long held, multi generational behaviors need to be broken in terms of that. So, what I want to do, Jan, is take a look into the future. I'll talk in a minute about air source heat pumps, but just before I get to that, I just wanted to get a view from you about what do you see coming down the line? What are going to be the heating technologies of the future that are going to accelerate that journey towards net zero?
I think it's a combination. Sometimes there's an impression when you follow the debate that it's either this technology or that one. I think ultimately we end up with a combination, but there are, in my view, some technologies that have more potential than others. I mean, heat pumps are clearly one of them, and in all of the scenarios that have been modeled by government itself or by advisors to government in the UK or also outside of the UK internationally, heat pumps show up as one of the most important, if not the most important technology, and that includes ground source heat pumps. And air source heat pumps, but also things like seawater heat pumps or river water heat pumps, using ambient heat from other sources than the ground or the air, but also district heating. It's a really important technology already in countries like Denmark, for example, where about 2/3 of homes are now connected to district heating systems, or in Sweden, where it has a very significant role too, or some of our Eastern European neighbors, where district heating has played a very important role historically and still does today. And then I think there are kind of more novel technologies like electric boilers coupled with storage. I mean, there's now a number of companies offering that as a solution where you're essentially charging up some form of heat storage with very cheap off-peak electricity on a cheap tariff, and then you're using it when you need the heat. So there are novel technologies like that coming to market as well. And I think we're going to see a combination of all of them. Certainly very skeptical is the idea that we're going to see a widespread use of so-called alternative gases like hydrogen or biomethane. There might be, I'm not saying they're not going to play any role at all, especially in very cold climates, to which I do not count the UK. But if you live in northern Canada, where you have temperatures in the winter of minus 40 degrees C, you could really see why you might want a hybrid system in some of those places, simply because down to those very low temperatures, there's a limit to how much heat pumps can economically provide. And you might not have the ability to have district heating in those places because they might be remote in rural locations. So there's certainly a role, I think, in some parts of the world, but I don't see a significant role of hydrogen heating, for example, in the UK. I think that's going to be very limited, maybe to some industrial clusters at the most. But even then, I don't see the economics quite stack up for direct heating with hydrogen, burning it in boilers.
Yeah, and I think that was also a solution that was mooted for some time for the replacement of petrol and diesel cars, wasn't it? But I think that sort of very quickly started to fade away. I think on the point you raised about how we can use technology and power and electricity in different ways, one of the things that's always puzzled me is why we are not transferring energy from electric vehicles. So if I take my own situation at home, both myself and my wife have got electric vehicles. At any one time, we've got 110, 100 kilowatts of power sat on our drive, and we're drawing down expensive energy in the day. We know we're not going to use those vehicles. And do you see a time when actually there will be a two-way transfer of power between things like electric vehicles and other devices to power homes more cost effectively, and for those to be topped up overnight, obviously, when the tariff rate is a lot lower?
Yeah, absolutely. And we've just done a project on vehicle to grid and using car batteries to not only smartly consume electricity, by scheduling it to when electricity prices are low, but also feeding it back into the grid. And that could be either to support the grid overall. For example, we had a few trials, didn't we, last winter from National Grid, where people got a text message being told, if you reduce your consumption during these hours, you're going to get paid. And the payment wasn't that substantial, but people still participated in it because they wanted to make a contribution. I mean, you can, of course, automate some of that. And with millions of electric vehicles and the size of batteries, the potential will be potentially quite large. But I think the other interesting area might be backup power. I mean, this is something already happening in the US, where the car makers actually advertise, some of their electric pickup trucks, for example, saying you can still run your home even if there's a blackout on the car battery. And there's a great advert where you see basically a big storm, and there's a guy with an electric chainsaw plugged into the truck, and I think the wife is sweeping the leaves with yeah. It's a really funny advert, but it basically it's a bit sexist too, but it really does kind of illustrate how the future marketing of this technology might look like. And especially in the US, where you have quite a few blackouts because of storms and longer distances and trees falling onto wires. That's the main reason for blackouts in the US, as in many other countries. Having that resource at a battery is actually it's a USP, isn't it? It's another benefit of having an electric vehicle. So I can see that playing a role too in the UK. I mean, you could actually run, and people, I think, underestimate the potential. You could run even with a heat pump, cooking, your lighting, everything in. If you have a fully charged battery, you could run your home on that for at least a day or two. I mean, depending on how efficient your home is, maybe more than that, just quite a lot. And it's a battery you already have, right? So no, definitely is something to watch. I think we haven't seen it being deployed yet at scale, where this is happening and thousands of people are doing it. It's still in the sort of pilot phase. There have been different projects, but it's definitely coming, and more of the car manufacturers are willing for their cars to participate and have the ability to communicate in a way that allows vehicle to grid and feeding into the grid. I think even Tesla is now a bit more open to the idea. They were very much against this idea of having their vehicles basically do anything but charging, but I think they're becoming more open to the idea too. So things are moving in that direction. When will it happen? We don't know yet, but the potential is clearly there, and it could really be quite beneficial.
We've heard it here first. Vehicle to grid is on its way. We're not quite sure when, but it's on its way. So Jan, that's a first on the pod. So thanks for that. Can I just rewind us back to air source heat pumps? I was particularly struck on our podcast with Steve McKenzie earlier in this season. He really did set out very starkly some of the misleading and unhelpful messages about air source heat pumps that do the rounds in local communities and lead to a sense of mistrust or skepticism over this type of tech. So, Jan, I thought it'd be useful if we could do a little bit of myth busting. First of all, if you could explain in non-techie terms, how do air source heat pumps actually work?
The heat pump is fundamentally very different to a fossil fuel combustion system, where you burn a fuel, could be a gas or it could be a solid fuel, and you're using the heat that generates to heat your home, right? We all know that. I mean, that's the old way of doing things. You light a fire or you have a gas boiler. You have a bit more modern heating system now, and it works. A heat pump is very different, because what the heat pump does is essentially it takes pre-existing heat that's already there in the air. Could also be the ground, or it could be in a water source. Doesn't really matter. It could be a waste heat source as well. That's more what happens in the industrial sector. And it's using that heat and compressing it and putting it somewhere else. That's what the heat pump actually does. Of course, how exactly it does that, I could spend a lot of time explaining that. But I think the main principle of a heat pump is fundamentally different. And I think people often don't quite understand, how can you create more energy with 1 unit of electricity than you put in? And that can't be possible. Well, you don't really. You just use the electricity to essentially transport pre-existing heat into the home. And because that is a very efficient process, you're getting something like maybe 3, maybe even 4 or 5 units of heat out of every unit of electricity. It's not magic. It just means that you're harvesting that heat that's already there, compressing it, and putting that into the home. And you're doing that by just using a very old thermodynamic principle, the vapor compression cycle. We all have a fridge, right? We all have a fridge in our houses. Yeah. Some people have several fridges. We all know air conditioning. It's exactly the same technology. It's using the same principles. And that's what the heat pump does. It just uses, for a different purpose. Rather than cooling something, it's using it to heat something.
Brilliant. That's absolutely one of the best explanations of air source heat pumps and how they work that I've ever heard. So thanks for that, Jan. I think in terms of some of the things that Steve left us with, I thought we could just do as part of a continued myth busting, a few true or false questions. So if I just ask you a couple of scenarios and you can tell us whether it's true or false and briefly why. So the first one we hear quite commonly is heat pumps don't work well during cold winters. So true or false?
Is there a third option, which is incomplete or something? No, it's, if I have to choose, it's false, but with some caveats. The efficiency of heat pumps will drop, especially air source heat pumps, as it gets colder. And that is simply because there's less heat around that can be harvested, and the heat pump needs to work harder to provide the same level of comfort. So your efficiency will drop, and that is measured by the coefficient of performance for those who are interested in that kind of detail. So that will drop. But it won't drop to zero. It will go down. And we've looked into the performance of heat pumps in the real world, looking at measurements of heat pumps. And what you see is, yes, there is a decline in efficiency, but even down at minus 15 degrees centigrade, heat pumps still provide the same heat as a gas boiler at almost 2 or 3 times the efficiency of a gas boiler. So the heat pumps still work. If they're sized correctly, they can provide the same comfort down to very low temperatures.
Great stuff. Second one was heat pumps are more expensive to buy and run than traditional gas central heating. True or false?
I'd say false, but again with a caveat. I mean, when it comes to the purchase, it is correct that heat pumps are more expensive, and you will need to pay probably more for a new heat pump than for a new gas boiler. But of course, there's a government grant currently available in the UK, the boiler upgrade scheme, giving you £7,500 towards the purchase cost. And in some cases, we're now seeing actually people getting quotes for £3,000 or less, in some cases, zero. So yeah, it's not necessarily true that the upfront costs are higher than gas spoilers after the government grant anymore for everybody. And when it comes to the running cost, it certainly is false, because you can already now beat the running costs of a gas spoiler relatively easily if you have a well-established system that is designed well, runs efficiently, and you couple it with a smart heat pump tariff. There are time varying tariffs on the market and heat pump tariffs. You can really undercut a gas boiler by doing that. The answer probably depends on what kind of system you have, how much you pay. But yeah, it's not true that heat pumps will always cost you more to run and to be installed than the alternatives.
Okay, so next one. Heat pumps work well in new homes, but not old ones. True or false?
That's definitely false. Most of the heat pumps currently installed in the UK under the boiler upgrade scheme are installed in existing homes, actually all of them, because new homes are not eligible for that grant. And also when you look at the electrification of heat project that the government commissioned, which is a trial of heat pumps, air source heat pumps in UK homes, those heat pumps were installed in homes of all types and ages. And the conclusion was that heat pumps work in all UK homes, regardless of age and type. And that's really because all you need to do is to design the system well enough. And if you have an old home, yes, it might be less efficient than a brand new home, but you just need a bigger heat pump, essentially, just as you would install a bigger fossil fuel heating system.
Yeah.
And of course, you need to make sure the system overall is set up to provide the comfort, having the rightly sized radiators, and making sure you have a smart management of the whole system. But no, there are plenty of old homes, and I live in one of them. I live in a building that is 144 years old now, Victorian terrace, modestly insulated with a heat pump, and it works just well. Very happy with it, and my wife never complains.
Okay, well, if it works for Jan, it can work for you. Final one, Jan. Heat pumps are the only credible low carbon heating solution. True or false?
No, that's false. I think there are many other solutions I mentioned already before, especially district heating, I would certainly point to. And I think also some of the other electric technologies, I think, have definitely some potential. And I also mentioned, I think, the potential role of hybrid systems in some places. I don't think we should just put all our eggs in one basket, but I think it is true that heat pumps are probably the most important technology when it comes to heating technologies that are currently available and on the cards, and they show up, as I said before, in all of the scenarios as the most important one.
Great stuff. My final question before we do flip the mic. So we've talked about how housing is responsible for a significant proportion of the UK's carbon emissions. So if you apply that, then it's logical to assume that housing associations, who manage 1 in 6 homes in the UK, have a really important role to play in tackling climate change. Loads of good progress already being made, particularly with retrofit projects, as well as the building of new and sustainable, and in some cases, zero carbon homes. However, having been on this journey for quite some time now, what has become clear is that there's a national shortage of green skills and a need for long-term funding to actually ensure that we give confidence to the supply chain and training providers. So what I mean by that is it's a bit of a chicken and egg scenario. What is it we need to do to give suppliers and manufacturers, first of all, the confidence to increase the scale of their production and thereby logically reducing costs? But also, the other key component for me is how do we make green skills a real option for many training providers and educational institutions?
It's a great question. And I think my answer is not going to be that we need government to sort this out by just putting more money into training. I think ultimately, when you look at other sectors or past transitions, a lot of the training ultimately happens because the market is moving in a certain direction. I think what we still don't have in the UK is clarity where things are headed. We still have an ongoing discussion about hydrogen and the future of the gas networks. I fear as long as we haven't sorted out the direction of travel, companies are not going to invest enough in training, and providers that can offer the training will not expand their offerings accordingly either. So it comes down, I think, ultimately to government being really clear where things are headed and providing the right framework to go about that. When you think back about the transition from coal to gas heating in the UK, those installers didn't exist, right? They didn't come out of nowhere. This was a process, and the industry very quickly adapted. It took years, of course, to complete, but these bottlenecks will be overcome, I believe, once it's clear where things are headed. And we're already seeing companies like Era, for example. I think it was just a week ago, I saw this is a Swedish company that entered the UK market earlier this year, and they install heat pumps in UK homes. They want to train 8,000 installers. This is just a single company. And of course, 8,000 installers is not enough. And you may say, but yeah, that's just a single company. And they have a new training academy, I think near Sheffield, if I'm not mistaken, where they're going to train these people, and other companies are following suit. So I don't think it's kind of a bottleneck that will prevent scaling production and deployment. I think ultimately this will be overcome. It comes down to government policy. And we didn't really talk about reforming prices and how we incentivize people to actually adopt low carbon technologies. Yeah, that's one of the key areas where government, I think, can play a role by sending the right price signals to people so they actually see savings when they switch away from fossil fuels and adopt clean heating technologies. Right now, we are in a situation where we penalize people because we put a lot of the policy costs and the carbon tax through the emissions trading system on electricity, but we don't do the same for using fossil fuels. So those kinds of things, I think, will ultimately be more important than spending lots of money on new training programs funded by government. I think that's something that will happen quite naturally once it's clear where things are headed.
Fascinating sort of set of scenarios there. And I think certainly for Yorkshire Housing, we've seen issues in terms of both supply chain confidence and a skills shortage that has been linked to the funding streams. So there is normally a significant pot of money that's made available, but with very short timescales for delivery attached to it. And all that creates is peaks and troughs in terms of demand. And invariably, that then just pushes up the price as well. So, yeah, absolutely resonate with what you've said there. Okay, so regular listeners will know that one of the new features we introduced in season 3 is Flip the Mic. And this, Jan, is basically where, as the name suggests, we flip the mic across to you to ask a couple of things that you might want to know from me. So it's all yours, Jan.
Yeah, I mean, what I would be quite interested in is how do you deal with this challenge of net zero as a housing association? What are you already doing, to address that? Where do you feel actually we can't sort this out ourselves? We need some support. We need more clarity from decision makers, from policymakers. Just be really curious how you approach this, because I know it's a huge capital investment that's going to be required for the assets that you're responsible for, and making those decisions must be difficult.
It is, but we, as Yorkshire Housing, we are committed to being a low carbon business. So within our 30-year business plan, we have set aside £400 million to decarbonise our existing homes. So we have a really strong and clear and funded commitment there. Will that do the job? Is that enough? No, is the short answer. We have used the figure that Savills have provided in terms of the average cost to decarbonise a home being £22,000. But I suspect both you and I know that the figure in many, many cases is far higher than that. So what we've done so far is we have used the energy ratings for all of our existing homes to target the most inefficient homes, so those that create the most carbon outputs, but also those that are the most expensive for our customers to live in. So we have prioritized the replacement, particularly, I have to say, in rural areas, oil-fired heating systems, but also inefficient gas heating systems, and indeed inefficient old storage heater systems as well. So we've had a really clear policy on, if you want to call it, worst polluting first, and really sort of gone to town with that. Alongside that, we've also had a really strong commitment to not building problems of the future. So at the moment, we build between 500 and 700 new homes each year. And we feel that we have a duty to ensure that those new homes have a really high level of efficiency in terms of how they're heated, how they're lit, and how energy is used in those homes. We want to go further, but all of our new homes at least achieve EPC-B. The vast majority achieve EPC-A, and indeed we're just about to take handover of some net zero homes as well in Leeds. So we are very much focused on how we can utilise some of the latest technology to ensure that we're not creating a problem in the future. And then alongside that, we're also working with a number of other housing associations and the combined authorities. We work in 3 Devo areas, so we've got 3 Devo mayors here in Yorkshire, all of whom have got a really strong commitment to decarbonisation, and all of whom have been really successful in bringing additional funding into the region. So we've also been working with them to ensure that we squeeze every last bit of benefit out of that additional funding that's coming through. But that is not going to get us to where we need to be. And I think for many of the reasons that we've chatted about on today's podcast. So what we need in terms of going forward, our trade body, the National Housing Federation, has talked about a need for a long-term plan for housing. Now, that's predominantly to address the housing crisis and the shortage of homes. But we've actually extended that and said that we need a long-term plan for how we're going to decarbonise our existing homes. But alongside that, we need a really clear plan in terms of how we will have the skills to not only install but also maintain these new ways of working in these new lower carbon heating forms, but also supply chain as well. So, I've said several times, when the Suez Canal was blocked by the boat that had drifted sideways, we had a program of retrofit which was put on hold because 2 boats behind that were our air source heat pumps waiting to be delivered to the UK. And I think what we're sort of saying is that if we can provide that certainty of supply, that will encourage manufacturers to develop more of this technology here in the UK, and indeed, preferably here in Yorkshire itself, and coupled with the skills providers being able to deliver the people that we need to actually fit those appliances. That for us is the golden triangle, if you want, of how we can move forward with confidence and also deliver at the pace that's needed. So that was one heck of a flip the mic question. So thanks for that, Jan. We do also have the quick fire round. So Jan, I've got 3 questions for you. So in just a few words, firstly, how optimistic are you that we can address the climate crisis?
I'm an optimist when it comes to this question. I think there's no other way. We have everything we need to tackle this problem. So I'm an optimist.
Okay, great. We love optimists on this pod. Second question is, how about you assume that all the world's leaders will listen in the next sort of month or so? What would you be saying to them? What's the most important thing that they need to do to ensure that we avoid the worst of the climate change that we're already experiencing?
No more short-termism and thinking more long-term would be my appeal. Being courageous and brave with the decisions they make. To solve this problem, we're going to need much bolder and long-termist approaches to this. So that would be my one ask.
You need to be bolder world leaders, long term. That's what we need. So, final one then from me, Jan. What are the 3 things we can all do that would make our homes and also the planet greener?
Well, we talked about heat pumps quite a bit in heating, but yeah, switch your fossil heating system for something that is low carbon. That's number one. I mean, the other big source of emissions is transport. If you have a car, use your car, whether that could be electric. That has a huge impact in terms of the avoided emissions. And then thirdly, I mean, it's not my area of expertise, but I think it's around diet and how much meat we consume. I think that's next up on the list after heating and transport. But yeah, I would say heating, mobility, and the diet we adopt are the 3 big areas where we can make significant change.
Great summary. That's now a wrap for this episode. Jan, I want to say a massive thank you to you for your insight and sharing your considerable knowledge in this field. It's been an absolutely fascinating discussion, and thanks for explaining what is a really complex set of issues so clearly. To all our listeners, just one final ask from me. I hope you'll join me for another episode of Raising the Roof. So please, please, please hit the subscribe button from wherever you get your podcasts. And thanks once again for tuning in.